The sermon today is inspired by the words of National Bishop Susan Johnson, who reflected on the story of the feeding of the 5,000, mentioned a few times and in various ways in the Gospels. She preached her sermon in the closing service at the special assembly of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada meeting in Calgary earlier this summer. But today, on this 10th Sunday after Pentecost, we hear the version from St. Matthew in his gospel, the story of the feeding of the 5,000. This text is very well known among Christians. And I must admit to you, as Bishop Susan did, I find it increasingly challenging to preach on well-known texts, to find a new angle. But there are different ways, a variety of ways you can look at it. You can look at it as a math problem. 12 disciples with 5 loaves and 2 fish, 5,000 people to feed, multiplied by a miracle we will call X, divided and eaten in the amount of Y equals 12 baskets of leftovers. I hated doing math problems like that in school. Last month, when I hiked with other Christians near Banff, the mountain and lakeside path concluded with a picnic near the beach. Since I was the only out-of-province hiker who arrived late the night before, I did not have time to put together a lunch. My hosts had provided a hearty breakfast for me, so I wasn't really all that hungry, and given the time change, would be fine until we returned back to Calgary later that afternoon. When everyone sat down at the picnic table, out came the lunch packs. Individuals brought sushi, fruit, hummus, wraps, and then began eating what they had packed for themselves. I had my water bottle, and during our lunch break was totally content to simply visit and behold the pristine mountain vista before our eyes. But to my pleasant surprise, someone handed me a bun, then some sliced meat with cut up lettuce and mayo. And someone else slid over some sliced apple and a container of cherries. Totally unexpected. I nonetheless realized how hungry I actually was after the morning hike, and I appreciated the kindness and generosity of my friends to share their food with me. The feeding of the 5,000 story emphasizes the compassion of Jesus, his heart for the crowd. It underscores as well, and once again, the reluctance and disbelief of the disciples. And of course, it's a wondrous miracle story. Along with Bishop Susan, I think perhaps my favorite interpretation of this text is that the sharing of the 5 loaves and the 2 fish is the miracle. The sharing of the 5 loaves and 2 fish is the miracle. I think the crowd is moved by seeing the disciples scrounging for their meager supplies. And I think they get motivated and realize they have gifts to offer as well. So someone finds they have a piece of cheese, and someone has some olives, and someone else has some dried meat, and someone else has some wine. And one by one, people bring forward what they have been hoarding, and it becomes a giant potluck with 12 baskets left over. It's like the hearts of the crowd are opened. And maybe that is the miracle, that Jesus is able to bring out the best in those present, the generous, giving, selfless best. But there's more. I think perhaps the most important part of the text is when the disciples say, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." They want to be left off the hook. Don't we all? They see trouble coming, an angry, hungry crowd of 5,000, and they want to avoid it. But Jesus turns around and says, you give them something to eat. You give them something to eat. You do it. It reminds me of the story of the raising of Lazarus. After Lazarus comes out of the tomb, Jesus tells his disciples, you unbind him. You do it. It was all fine and good to depend on Jesus to do everything when he was with them. But Jesus was preparing his disciples for the time when he would not be there. Not that he ever abandons them. We know his promise to be with them until the end of time. But as Jesus called the disciples, they were being trained to carry on Jesus' ministry after his time on earth. We are Jesus' called disciples. And now Jesus calls and asks us the same thing. Delegates to that special convention of the ELCIC earlier in the summer in Calgary received that message loud and clear. You do it. You address climate change. You feed the hungry. You take a stand on what it means to be in healthy relationships with all people, not just with those who are like us. It's not someone else's job. As Christians who worship Jesus today, we are responsible as Christ bearers for using the resources we have been given to do the mission of God in the world today, in whatever way we have been equipped and gifted to do it. It won't be easy. We will be vulnerable to others. We will make some mistakes. We have to be ready for that. But when the value, the measure, and the goal is the love of God in Christ Jesus for all people and for all God's creation, then we can trust this God to see us through. Because Jesus will also bring out the best in us, the generous, giving, selfless best. We may not recognize the gifts we have. We may at first be reluctant to use them. We may be blocked by some reason to release our gifts to the world. But when we try, take that first small step in our vulnerability, but out of a heart of love for others, Jesus will bring out the best in us. And then we too, like the disciples of old, shall behold the wonder of God.